Everything I put out so raw, you just can't snip. I got the best O-line, even on goal line, you can't bliss it. You're not a hustler, you keep getting in front of, you just can't flip it. You ain't really got it, you P. Diddy, you be remixing. Oh, where we just got a new Glock? That's a free biscuit. Penny Tupac know what's up, we know on the mill tick.
Edward Jonathan. The majority holds that the defendant's life sentence was a departure from the minimum sentencing guidelines, but concedes that the sentence was proportionate to his criminal convictions. I will hold that the habitual offender statutes provide the sentencing with the court's discretion to sentence defendant to life imprisonment. Defendant is a contract killer. His convictions represent the outcome of 2 out of 3 trials he faced for murders of 3 separate victims. At the murder trial for co-defendants Ernest Gordon III and Corey McCullough, defendant testified that he alone, not his co-defendants, killed Ian French. He killed one of his victims at the behest of a drug dealer who suspected the victim of providing information to the police. He has a long and violent criminal history and began his occupation as a street assassin shortly after his release from prison for defendant was also sentenced to life imprisonment for the first-degree murder convictions, 30 to 80 to 60 months imprisonment for the felony possession of a firearm conviction, and 5 years imprisonment for the felony firearm conviction. Number 2, defendant was convicted following another trial of a felon in possession of a firearm. In that case, defendant was charged with killing Michael Moore, but the jury found defendant not guilty of murder and felony firearm. Defendant was sentenced as a 4th offense habitual offender to use of other acts as evidence of character is generally excluded to avoid the danger of conviction based on a defendant's history of misconduct. A proper purpose for omission is one that seeks to accomplish something other than the establishment of a defendant's character and his propensity to commit the offense. In this case, the prosecutor have relied on several legitimate purposes, motive chief among them, for introducing evidence that defendant acted in his role as a hired killer. In this case, however, the trial court found a compelling justification in the prosecutor's inability to counter defendant's representation of the informant as a false witness, and we agree. And number 5, our court recognized that a prosecutor may introduce evidence of other facts for the proper purpose of demonstrating a lack of mistake or fabrication in a witness's accusations. In that case, the defendant's adopted daughter alleged sexual abuse against her father only after his stepdaughter accused him of a similar conduct. In this case, the informant testified that the defendant told him that he was stockpiling weapons to use in his new vocation as a hitman. Defendant also hinted or outright revealed to the informant beforehand his intentions to commit the 3 murders and verify them after they were accomplished. As in Starr case, the evidence introduced in this case confirmed that the prosecution key witness did not merely invent the circumstances of criminal activity. The evidence demonstrated that the defendant often accurately bragged of his criminal exploits to the informant, perhaps to recruit him for other murders or merely for personal aggrandizement. Now, mind you, the case where we talk about the sexual assault, that's a reference from another case they used to appeal their case. In regard to the defendant Ernest Gordon III, a jury failed to reach a verdict and a trial court ordered a mistrial. After retrial, a jury convicted Gordon of second-degree murder. The trial court sentenced him as a habitual third offender. Now, mind you, remember, Jonathan came to his court date and said he merely alone did it. This case arose from the shooting death of Ian French, who died in the home from 12 gunshot wounds from 2 different caliber weapons sometime between the late hours of February 3rd, 2003 and the early hours of February 4th, 2003. French was a distributor of high-grade marijuana. He also used other drugs, particularly heroin, on January 30th, 2003. French asked Damian Johnson and James Schultz to travel from Grand Rapids to Detroit to obtain heroin from French. Johnson and Schultz complied with French's request. Upon returning to Grand Rapids, Johnson then arranged for Gordon to drive Schultz and him to French's home, where Gordon first met French. French told Gordon that he trafficked marijuana. On February 3rd, 2003, at approximately 2 a.m., Gordon called Johnson and asked for French's phone number because Gordon wanted to highlight French about some business. Johnson gave Gordon the phone number. Later that day, around 8 p.m., French called Johnson and asked and was provided Gordon's phone number. In the early morning hours of February 3rd, 2003, McCullough called Edward Jonathan from Grand Rapids and asked if he was interested in trading a half ounce of heroin for a half pound of high-grade marijuana. Jonathan obtained a half ounce of heroin in Detroit. Jonathan left Detroit for Grand Rapids at around 2 p.m. on February 3rd, driving his sister's white Grand Am. Later that day at around 8 p.m. or 9 p.m., Christian Burke, a friend of French, stopped by French's house and purchased $200 of marijuana. Burke testified that French had told him that he had recently received $70,000 worth of high-grade marijuana. He also noticed a large stack of Viagra samples. Around 9:30 p.m., French told Burke to leave because he had somebody stopping over. When Jonathan arrived in Grand Rapids, McCullough directed him over his cell phone to McCullough's girlfriend, Yvonne Thompson. Thompson is also Gordon's sister. Jonathan stayed at Thompson's home until 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. and then drove McCullough to a nearby Marathon station where they met Gordon. Jonathan had never before met Gordon. McCullough got into Gordon's white minivan and Jonathan followed Gordon to a Myers store. Gordon and McCullough went into the store and came out together, but Jonathan claimed he did not know if they made a purchase. Jonathan followed Gordon and McCullough to French's home. Gordon went into French's house, and McCullough and Jonathan waited together in Gordon's van. Gordon then called McCullough, and Jonathan went inside French's house with the heroin. Jonathan claimed to have had two guns in his possession, a .38 caliber and a .40 caliber pistol that he was holding for McCullough, who owed him money. At trial, Jonathan testified on behalf of Gordon, and with no objection from McCullough, Jonathan basically testified that Gordon and McCullough set up the drug deal between he and French, and that after the deal, he alone robbed and murdered French. At the time, Jonathan testified a jury had already convicted him of murdering French, but he had not yet been sentenced. Also, Jonathan had previously been convicted of murder for hire in an unrelated case. Jonathan testified that inside the house he gave Gordon the heroin, and Gordon and French went to the kitchen to sample it and weigh it. Afterwards, French gave Jonathan a half pound of marijuana, and French told Jonathan that he wanted more heroin. Jonathan and French began to talk about Jonathan's heroin connection. After McCullough honked the car horn, Gordon went outside, leaving Jonathan and French to talk about Jonathan's heroin connection. Jonathan testified that he became frustrated that French would not show him a larger quantity of marijuana. Jonathan then asked to use the bathroom. When French stood to show him where it was, Jonathan struck him in the head with the gun. By gunpoint, Jonathan ordered French not to move and retrieved a roll of duct tape from the kitchen counter, which he then used to bind French. Jonathan stabbed French in the arm and demanded French tell him where his marijuana was located, but French consistently told him that it was not in the home. Jonathan claimed that he searched the home but did not find the large amount of marijuana. He again tried to force French to tell him where the marijuana was located, but French did not tell him. Jonathan then shot French several times with a .38 caliber pistol. French was not dead, however, and Jonathan shot him several more times with the .40 caliber pistol. Jonathan testified that after he killed French, he went directly home to Detroit. He stated that he did not see Gordon and McCullough after Gordon left French home. In Detroit, he sold his guns to a friend, though he later brought back the .40 caliber pistol. Police later raided Jonathan's home and found the .40 caliber pistol alongside with a cache of weapons, including 2 bulletproof vests, 3 assault rifles, a flash suppressor. Jonathan also testified that he did not intend to rob French until he was in his home, and he did not tell Gordon or McCullough about his intent to rob French. He also maintained that McCullough never entered the house. The prosecution established that the following calls were made between defendants and Jonathan phones around the time of the offense between January 24th, 2003 and February 2nd, 2003. There were 17 phone calls between McCullough and Gordon. On February 3rd, 2003, there were 17 phone calls again, and then there were 13 phone calls between McCullough and Gordon. Between January 20th, 2003 and January 29th, 2003, there were 8 phone calls between McCullough and Jonathan. From January 30th, 2003 to February 2nd, 2003, there were no phone calls between McCullough and Jonathan, but February 3rd, 2003, there were 24 phone calls between McCullough and Jonathan. After February 3rd, there were 11 phone calls, and we can go on and on and on. These calls will bounce off cellular towers, tend to establish the defendant's location and his movements. The prosecution also presented evidence that Gordon was at Thompson's house in the evening of February 3rd, 2003. Thompson reluctantly testified that later in the evening of February 3rd, 2003, she saw a white car in the driveway she believed was Jonigan's car. She observed 2 or 3 people standing near the open trunk of the car. She testified that she wired money to McCullough in Detroit February 4th, 2003. She testified on February 4th, 2004. She observed McCullough with marijuana that he previously did not have. Her description of McCullough and the marijuana, and it was all noted. It's crazy. In May and July 2003, felony complaints were issued against Gordon, McCullough, and Jonigan as co-defendants, generally alleging that they conspired and murdered French. The trial court granted Jonigan's motion for a separate trial. As mentioned, Jonigan was tried first, and the jury convicted him of murdering French. At the initial consolidated trial, Gordon and the jury began deliberating on September 20th, 2004. After McCullough, jury began deliberations the next day, and we know how that went. He testified that he alone killed him, and they still got these boys locked up. That's crazy.